Okay, so today we're going to talk about doing presentations, specifically scientific presentations to do either a research poster or a research talk. And I'm going to start off with posters and spend most of the time talking about posters. But there's posters is usually where everybody starts doing scientific presentations. And it's pretty good practice for actually getting ready to do a full research talk. So I'll go through talking about posters a bit first. What's the purpose of doing a research poster presentation? What content you would expect to see research poster. For the most part, it should be quite similar to a research article with a few exceptions. And then looking at the poster structure and format, kind of the visual design that's expected for a poster. And then I'll go through some suggestions for some software for creating posters and also for working with graphics. And then give you some hints or pointers for printing and transporting your poster and getting it set up. And then we'll talk a little bit about presenting a poster, which kind of leads right into giving a research talk. So in a research talk, we'll go over giving a 15-minute research talk, and then introduce you to this idea of doing a 3-minute flash talk, which might be the first research talk you give, because it is common for flash talks to be used as kind of an advertisement for a poster. So if one of the organizers of a meeting is interested in your poster, they might invite you to give a 3-minute flash talk. And then I'm not going to talk about a research seminar, but for the most part, you guys will not be getting started doing research seminars unless, if you're undergraduate, you might do a research seminar talk like in your senior year as kind of an overview of everything that you've done in research. Same thing for graduate students. You actually have to do a thesis defense. You'll actually probably do a couple research talks along the way as well. But that's kind of the, I guess, the ultimate research talk is giving a 1-hour seminar. Okay, flip slides. Okay, so what is a research poster? It's basically an informal way to present your research. It's not as formal as publishing a paper, and also not as formal as giving a research talk. And it's usually, if you go to a regional meeting or a national meeting that's organized around a particular research topic, you're usually going to be giving poster presentations in a very crowded room. It's usually very loud. There's lots of people walking by. It's lots of distractions and everything. And I guess one of the advantages and disadvantages is that you do multiple presentations. So you might stand by your poster for an hour or 2 hours, and during that time you'll have people come up and ask you questions. And if you're there for an hour, you might do anywhere from 5 to 10 different little presentations of your research. So it's a good way to practice giving a presentation. But there's, it's a little bit informal because the timing that you're giving the presentations is going to be a variable. It'll depend upon questions that are asked, how deep you go into your presentation, or some of the ideas on your poster will depend on how interested your audience is. They have some cats fighting. They are free to, just say, well, thank you, and just walk away. So it's good and bad in that respect, because you get immediate feedback to, are they interested in your research? Are they interested in the way that you present your research? So it's a good way to get feedback into practice. And part of that is that you get two-way dialogue. So you can actually, you're talking one-on-one with one person. You might be presenting to 2, 3, or 4 people at a time, but it's not going to be much bigger of a group than that. Now, one of the things you want to consider when you're doing a research poster is look at everybody that comes up to your poster as like a potential collaborator. They've obviously stopped by your poster because they're interested, and you can talk to them, ask them questions, and you might, establish a collaboration or at least meet a new friend. If you have faculty coming by looking at posters, you might get to meet a faculty that you might be interested in working with in the future if you're going to graduate school, for example. It's a good way to kind of do a mini interview with potential faculty that you might want to work with. Same thing if it's a venue that has people from industry. It's a good way to get introduced to people in industry that if you're sending out resumes for industrial positions, you can have some interaction with someone before you actually send out a resume and get some ideas as to what their interests are, what kind of research they do at their company, and how you might fit into a company like that. So it's a good way to network. So you can meet other students, meet faculty, industry lab scientists, and also company representatives. You might, get some ideas that maybe you don't want to do laboratory research, but you're interested in scientific instrumentation, and you can meet some people that are at the meetings that's their focus is as representatives for companies that produce equipment, and you might be interested in participating and getting involved in that, or you're actually getting into the development of instrumentation. So it's a good way to network and meet some people that might be interesting to your future. It's also a good way to prepare for doing a real research talk, because you get some practice. And the other aspect of it is if you do a poster presentation and someone from another school stops by and sees your talk, maybe it's someone from MUSC, for example, if you're here, and they're interested, and they might invite you to come visit and because they're interested in the topic that you're talking about, and ask you to do a mini seminar for their laboratory or something like that. So that's kind of the purpose as to why we're interested, why we like to do poster presentations. It's a lot less formal than doing a full research talk, and you have a lot more interaction. So I think it's good. Over here is an example of a poster, just kind of showing you the general format. I'm going to go through some of the details of this, but this just gives you a rough idea as to what a poster should look like. I'm not, at least for this particular poster, I obviously was not into doing colorful backgrounds. So it's very simple background, just a white background. But in some cases that's good because leaving some white space allows you to focus on the results. So this poster has a lot of colorful pictures on it, and having a white background like this draws your attention to the figures, which is what you really want to be focusing on when you're doing the presentation. So that's one example of the style of doing a poster. Okay, so poster content. So generally this follows the structure of a journal article that we talked about on Tuesday. So journal articles generally have this IMRD structure, which stands for introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Now, there's a little bit of difference here, and a little bit of difference of emphasis primarily. Some of the very important things of a poster that that I've highlighted here in bold. The title, of course, is very important. The title is what's going to attract attention to your poster. People are going to look at the title first and decide, am I interested in looking at this poster or not, based on the title for the most part. Authors and affiliations, of course, you have to have that. You do have to prepare an abstract. So if you're going to attend a scientific conference or a meeting, you're going to have to write an abstract that gives a summary of your research, including the introduction, the hypothesis, highlighting some of the results and conclusions. But the abstract will not normally appear on the poster. Some meetings might ask you to actually reproduce the abstract on the poster, but for the most part, the abstract is submitted when you apply for a meeting, and then they'll usually put together a program booklet, and the abstract will be in the program booklet. So that's another way of advertising your poster. People will look at the title, read the abstract, and then decide if they want to go to your poster and get more information. Now, I've highlighted your introduction. That's an important part of the poster, the introduction, which includes the background and your hypothesis. The hypothesis is basically just the research question that you're trying to answer. Materials and methods should be part of a poster, but you're not going to have as much detail as you would, say, for instance, in a research article. But you do still want to have a materials and methods section so people can see what experiments that you've done, and you can provide some details, but not too much details on the methods. You basically want to have brief descriptions for the methods so that people can recognize what experiments you're doing. Next section is results. The results is really the bulk of the poster. The poster should really be built around the figures. There should be brief, concise legends that go with each of the figures. But the figures you really want to stand on their own as much as possible. So making clear and understandable figures is very important. You've heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And figures really should be designed around that, so that someone can look at a figure and kind of interpret the data that is being presented to that figure and be able to understand it without having too much explanation required. The next section, which appears in a journal article, is discussion. And actually, this part is not included in a poster in general. The reason for that is that you're actually going to be providing the discussion. So as you go through the poster presentation, and as you're going through the results, you're going to be providing the discussion part of the results. And the discussion part of the results is explaining what the results are and what they mean. And so you would be actually doing that as part of the presentation of the poster. So that's not included. But you do want to include a conclusion. The introduction and the conclusion are kind of the parts of the poster that are most likely to be looked at by people that are walking by the poster, and that's going to draw them in, and they'll look at the introduction and see what hypothesis that you're working on, what kind of research question you're looking at, and then they might look at the conclusion and see, how far did you get into the hypothesis? Were you able to address the hypothesis? That should come up in the conclusion. Were you able to answer the research question? And then if that interests them, they'll stop and ask you questions and have you go through the results. Next section, references. References seem like they take up a lot of space, but they are actually very important when you're doing a poster presentation. One of the reasons for this is that if someone stops by your poster because they're interested in what you're presenting, it's possible that they might be doing work in the same field, and they might have done work that you are using as part of your background and creating your hypothesis. And in that case, it's very important that you actually reference them so they can see that, you know, hey, I see some ideas that were derived from work that I'm doing. And if you have a reference of them, then they're going to, you know, look very favorable at your poster. You definitely want to have references for people that that might stop by and see your poster. Acknowledgments should also be included. These are contributions from non-authors. You also want to include funding. That's how you get to pay for your research, how you get to pay for if you're on a stipend, what agency is paid for your stipend. And then I put supplementary information here. You might provide links to other information. If you have, you know, information that's stored on a website or a publication of your own, you could also include in supplementary information contact info. So if you want to give, I don't recommend necessarily giving your personal email address, but if you're working, say, at Coastal, for example, you can provide your Coastal email address so someone can get in touch with you if they have more questions. Okay, so some general guidelines for the poster content. You want to minimize text. That's one of the reasons you don't include a discussion. The primary text that you're going to have where you have any real explanation of things is the introduction and the conclusions. The figure legends will also have text, but that should be very concise. And in general, you want the text to be pretty concise. In comparing figures and text, you should be about 50-50 between figures and text. And if I go back to this poster example here, you can see that, you know, I'm probably biasing in this poster a little more towards figures than text, but maybe 40% of the poster space, if you just look at the space, is probably text. And then the rest, about 60%, is figures. So that's, you know, somewhere around a 50-50 ratio is what you want. You don't want to have a poster that's all text. People don't want to be, you know, just standing there reading your poster. The poster is meant to inspire conversation, and not having people stop by and just stand there and read your poster for 10 minutes. You want to be talking to them for 10 minutes, presenting, and have an opportunity to have a conversation with them. So figures are important. The figures, again, should tell a story. Each figure should kind of tell its own story without having to do a lot of explanation, a lot of reading of the figure legend. And the figures themselves should kind of link together from one to the other and should tell the overall story that you're trying to tell. You should be able to see a lot of that from the figures themselves. Writing should be readable to a broad audience. You might be doing, you know, very hardcore analytical chemistry work, but you might have someone who is an organic chemist stop by and wants to understand, you know, how are you doing GC analysis for compounds that you're using, and you want to be able to put your text in a way that it's approachable to everybody that's in the general field. So whether that's chemistry, biochemistry, or biology, you want people to be able to come up that are, you know, not necessarily lay public, but a very broad audience with a science background, but maybe not in your particular field that you're working on at that moment. So not overly technical. And at the same time, when you're putting together your poster, leave out some of the textual content that you will be presenting. You know, a prime example of that is the discussion. You're going to basically leave out the entire discussion, which would be a major part of a research paper if you were writing a research paper, because you're going to be presenting that as you go through the poster. Same idea with the introduction. You want to briefly, concisely describe the background. You want to hit all the key points in the background so someone can follow and see, okay, this is what led up to your hypothesis or the research question that you're trying to answer. But you don't want to be overly descriptive. You want to provide enough description so that someone can follow the ideas from one to the other within the introduction. But you're also going to be talking about the introduction as well. So you want to be able to give yourself some space to be able to present. And what else? So in the conclusion, you want to make sure you address the hypothesis, the research question you were trying to answer. And that should be described in the conclusion as to how your results lead up to. They might not answer the research question or hypothesis, but how do they contribute to getting towards the answer that you want? Poster presentations are usually cutting edge research. It's stuff that is being done, you know, the day before you do the presentation. So there's not an expectation that your conclusion is going to be, you know, the final answer to whatever hypothesis or research question that you're working on. So keep that in mind. Your audience is not going to expect you to have the answer to, you know, to what you were researching, but they want to see, you know, how far have you gotten? What ideas do you have that you're going to be testing in the future? So all of that can be part of the conclusion. You know, how far have you gotten in answering the question? Bring Anna back in. And how far have you gotten into answering the research question? And then where you might go next. You know, once you've answered a question or part of a question, sometimes that brings up other things that you want to do, other experiments that you want to do. So you can present that as part of the conclusion. People like to see kind of where you're going next. Okay. All right, so format. This is one of the possible formats that most people follow for poster presentations. And the idea here is to lay out the poster in such a way that it helps you tell the story. When you're doing your presentation, you want your audience to be able to focus, say, starting on the left side of the poster and then work the way across to the right side of the poster. And it's a good idea to organize your poster in columns. So in this case, this has been laid out with 4 different columns. For those that still read paper newspapers, it's kind of the same format that you would see in a newspaper. So each column you read, you know, from top to bottom, and then overall you go from left to right as you go through the poster. And so that helps with your audience being able to follow along. If you're, you know, not at your poster, or if you're busy talking to someone else, it makes it easy for someone to walk up and go through your poster. You know, the figures should go in order, and it makes it easy to kind of tell a story graphically in that way as well. So at the top, we have the title. The title should be concise. As much as possible, try not to include acronyms. I know if you're doing biochemistry research, that's very difficult because everything is named by their acronyms, and that's pretty much the only way anybody knows. Nobody, in some cases, people don't know what the acronym actually is, or what the different letters actually stand for in some cases. But very importantly, with title, you want to try to grab people's attention. You want the title to be readable. You want it to be interesting. You want it to be something that intrigues people, that makes them want to stop and say, hey, I wonder, you know, there's something interesting about the title that makes them want to look further into the poster. Below that, you should have the authors and affiliations. And then the way this poster is laid out, it's recommended to put the introduction on the top left so it's easy to see. It gets people starting on the left side of the poster. And in a similar way, you want to put the conclusions on the far right side of the poster, and preferably up towards the top. The top of the poster is easier for people to see. It's easier for them to read. And both of these, as I mentioned before, are going to be ways to get people interested in the poster. So in the introduction, you're kind of presenting what is the significance of this research field that you're working in. And the conclusions, you're kind of telling them, you know, what do your findings actually mean? How do they fit into the bigger picture of research in that field? And so a lot of people will read the introduction, and if they can find the conclusion easily, and if you put it up in the upper right, like it is on this poster, it's easy to find. They can look at the conclusion and they say, oh, wow, you found something interesting. I want to see more details about what you found and how you did the experiments. And so the actual figures in here are really the bulk of the poster. The way I've got this laid out here, there's one figure here that is associated with the introduction. And usually it's a good idea to have some kind of graphical scheme or, you know, some kind of an idea figure up front in the or near the introduction. And when you're presenting, that gives you something to point to when you're doing the presentation, and gives people kind of a visual explanation of the introduction. So it might be a schematic figure for a mechanism for a biochemical reaction or cellular reaction that's going on with, say, signal transduction, and you can show the different players in the signal transduction pathways, and all that is in that figure, and it's easy to explain when you're going through your introduction. In the center of the poster is really the focus of attention. So just visually, in terms of layout, the center of the poster should have the most important part of what you're trying to present. And there should be a little bit of a bias as much as possible towards things towards the top of the poster. Some of the most important things would be up towards the top of the poster. Now that's difficult to do if you're, depending on how you're laying out the poster, but it's going to be easier for people to see figures that are towards the top. But again, it's important for the figures and how they're laid out to tell a story. So if you start with the results here in figure 2 and then go through 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, someone should be able to walk up to your poster, and just by looking through those figures, they should have a general idea of what your research is and what you found, what your results are. And then you can explain in more detail when you do the presentation. And then the last figure here is associated with the conclusions. It's a good idea to have a figure that kind of summarizes the results and puts all the results together and provides some meaning for the research and what you found in doing the research for your poster. In addition to that, so down on the lower left here, we have methods. Again, things that are towards the bottom, you're kind of downplaying a little bit, but you still want to include methods. It's a good idea to have brief descriptions of each of the experiments done, and include references to protocols that you have used. So you can put in-text citations in the methods, and then down on the lower right here, you actually have the references. And so same idea with the references. Be thorough, make sure you include all the references, but be concise in the style that you pick to present them. So for instance, you can pick a reference style that doesn't include titles, maybe includes the first author only, but you want to provide enough information that if someone walks up to your poster and they did some of the research that you're relying on, they'll be able to recognize, oh, you cited me. You've looked at my work, and you're giving credit for the work that I did that you're relying on for your research. So it's important to have references. Also down at the bottom left, we have acknowledgments, the source of funding, and then this is kind of a box for supplementary info, which could include contact information or links to other information that people can look at. I've even seen recommended that you could put in Q codes if you wanted to. I've never actually done that, but you can put in things that direct people to where they can find other information about the research that you're doing. Okay. So a couple of style points, or a few, more than a couple, a few style points to consider when you're putting together a poster. First, and not part of the style points, but probably the most important, is make sure you follow the instructions from the meeting organizers. One of the most important, of course, is going to be the poster size. They're going to tell you what size poster you're allowed to have. And a lot of that will depend upon the space that they have available, and it will depend upon, you know, if they're using poster boards for everybody to put their posters on, it's going to depend upon the size of the poster boards that they're able to obtain. So poster size is an important consideration to start with. And then they might also have some instructions regarding the content. For example, they might require that an abstract be included in the poster. And in that case, you want to make sure that you follow the instructions and you put an abstract there. So make sure you include all the elements and make sure you got the right poster size and all that. And so that's important first part to think about. So some style points, as I highlighted before in the poster that I showed you at the beginning, use your white space. White spaces or background space that doesn't have any text or figures is a way of highlighting the figures that you're trying to present. So you want some boundary between the different figures. If you have a white background, you want to have some white space around each of the figures. That makes it easier for people to focus on each of the figures individually and not get distracted by ones that are beside them and kind of go off in the wrong direction. Overcrowding in a poster is very distracting, and it confuses people, and then they will, if they're confused, they'll walk away because they don't, you know, it's too much work for them. So you want to help out your audience as much as possible, so provide some white space around everything. Kind of along the same lines, it's a good idea to lay out your poster using kind of a grid, an invisible grid layout. And this makes it easier for visually to go from one element to the next. So it helps with the content flow of the poster, which is the next point. So in general, if you lay out your poster in columns, each of the columns you want people to go from left to right, as we usually read. And in each of the columns, you go from the top to the bottom. And so if you have a grid layout, it makes it easier for people to follow that, that directionality in the poster. Now, in using fonts, a lot of people get very creative with fonts. In posters, it's generally not a good idea to use a bunch of different fonts. You want to be restrained in the fonts that you use because it makes it easier for people to understand what's going on. General recommendation is use 1 or 2 fonts that are the same typefaces throughout your poster. If you use 2 fonts, what's recommended is to pick a non-serif font and a serif font that are complementary to each other. And if you search on the internet, you can find lists of fonts that are considered complementary to each other. Just kind of an example, back to the poster here. So I didn't highlight this before, but in the title and the headings for each of the title and headings that are shown here, these are all done with a sans serif font or a non-serif font, which means basically that the letters don't have little decorations on them. Whereas in a serif font, you have got little curls and everything at the ends of each line. It's actually easier to read If you're reading, say, a block of text, it's easier to read it usually if it has serifs, if it's a serif type font. But for titles and headings, a way to highlight those and draw attention that they are titles and headings is to use a sans serif font. So that's one recommendation. Of course, if you need to use Greek characters and everything, you're going to have to use a symbol font. So that would bring you up to 3 different fonts, but I'm not actually counting that symbol fonts in that counting. Next point is consistency in the fonts. Use the same type size and typeface for the same elements. So when you get to the end of putting together a poster, which is usually a very arduous process, and you're bringing together things from all different files and pasting in different elements and everything, it's very easy to mix up font sizes and typefaces, bold and italics and all that. It's a good idea to go back through and look at each of the elements that you have. So say the headings, and make sure all the headings are the same type size. Make sure if you're using bold headings, make sure that all of them are bold and they're the same size. So that goes into the readability of the font sizes. For your title, it's a good idea to put the title in bold. It's usually not a good idea to capitalize all letters in your title. Some meetings might actually require you to do that, but it's a little bit awkward. So if you don't have to do that, don't do that. You want to use just a normal title case. So you can capitalize the first letters, but don't put everything in capitalization. But you do want the title to be bold. You want it to be easy to read. Anywhere from 60 to 80 point font size is easy to read from far away. So if someone's walking up to your poster, they can be 12 feet away and be able to read the title. Authors, you want it to be a smaller font so you can fit in all the authors. 40 to 48 is a good font size for that. And usually most meeting organizers will ask you to underline whoever is presenting. So you can underline yourself since you'll be presenting, so underline your name. And then people know that, that you're the one who's standing next to the poster and doing the presentation. Headings, again, a little bit smaller than the authors maybe, or maybe about the same size. It's a good idea to highlight the headings by putting them in bold. You can put them in italics, or you can underline them. Pick one of those 3. Don't do all 3 at the same time. You just need to highlight them a little bit. Bold is usually a good way to do it. The text, you want the text to be big enough so that people can read it when they're standing a few feet away from your poster. So maybe 6 feet away from your poster. So probably the minimum size text that you want to include on a poster in the body text that you want people to be able to read is 24 points. So 24 to 32 is probably a good size for the text. Font legends you can make much smaller. If people are really interested, they'll get close and read through the figure legends and the references. So you can shrink those a little bit and take them down to 18 points if necessary to get everything to fit on your poster. Color selection. As a general rule, you want a contrast so people can read easily. As a general rule, black type on a white background or a lightly colored background is a good idea. It makes it easy to read. Avoid using bright primary colors, which are kind of harsh and too contrasty and difficult to read, like bright greens and bright reds and even bright blues. So go a little bit off of primary, and it's easier to read if you have to put text and colors. Avoid combining red and green colors together because there is a small portion of the population that is colorblind and will not be able to see what you're actually trying to portray. It's a general good idea to use light backgrounds. If you're going to use a colored background other than white, you want a lightly colored background so it's easy to read black text on top of that. As a general rule, it's usually recommended to do bluish or greenish colors because they're more calming. They don't get people upset and excited too much. And this is kind of a style point, but at least my preference is to use color sparingly. You know, it's a good idea to use color because it's attractive to have color on your poster. But you don't want your post to be, you know, overly decorative. You want to use color to really highlight what you're trying to present. So if you include color in the figures, it attracts the eye, attracts attention. But if you have a lot of color in the background, that's going to distract away from what you're trying to present. Again, you want to check for readability. Once you print your poster, you want to be able to, you know, be standing about 6 feet away from it and be able to read it. Anything less than 24 points is probably too small to be able to read from that distance. Okay, so that kind of brings us to preparing your poster. Some recommended software. Most people are probably going to be using for putting together posters, Microsoft PowerPoint, and primarily because it is ubiquitous. Most people have that on their computer, and it's usually free. So free is always good. If you are at a university that has a site license for Adobe products, I would recommend learning to use Adobe InDesign. It's a little more professional and is a useful way to put together a poster. Plus, you'll learn some skills that might prove useful in the future. Scribus, I have no experience with whatsoever. It is free and open source. So again, free is good. So if you have an aversion to PowerPoint, you can try that. If you have a Mac computer, Keynote might be useful. I have a Mac computer, but have not actually used Keynote for presenting or for preparing posters. Poster Genius is recommended by some people. I've not used that. It is no longer supported and it's not free. It's still available though. So if you know someone who's used that, you might try it out and see if you like it. So those are some programs for, you know, giving you the overall layout for your poster and organizing things in your poster and presenting it as we've been recommending. Now, figures, again, I kind of hopefully overemphasized enough that figures are really the driving force of your poster. You want figures to be easy to understand, easy to, you know, to look at and get the story from that figures without too much explanation. So it's the programs that you use for designing figures and creating figures are very important. If you're going to present data, it's a good idea to do it graphically as much as possible. Graphs of data are going to be better than providing tables of data where someone's supposed to look through numbers and see a trend or see a high point in the data. So Microsoft Excel or any of the other spreadsheet programs, they have ways to make graphs that, that you can use. For actually designing your own graphics, for instance, the one that's shown here over here on the right, this was done with Adobe Illustrator. So you can draw your own introduction schemes, and Illustrator is a good way to do that. Illustrator is a vector-based graphics program. The drawback, of course, is it is expensive, but if you're at a university that has a site license, I would go ahead and use it. Other variations on vector-based or other possibilities, options for vector-based graphics, Affinity Designer works very well. I've used that. It's much cheaper. I think it's $100 maybe for Affinity Designer. But it's also a vector-based graphics program. Inkscape is free, It's also vector-based, so if you don't want to spend any money, I'd recommend that. That works pretty well. The other type of graphics editor or image editor is a raster-based image editor, and probably all of you have heard of Photoshop. Photoshop is good for editing photos, but it's also good for editing pictures that you might have that are associated with data that you've collected in the laboratory. So Adobe Photoshop is a raster-based image editor. It again is expensive, but it's very professional. Cheaper options are Affinity Photo, which is from the same people that make Affinity Designer, and Pixelmator is also a raster-based image editor. And for a free option that's an open source option, GIMP is free and also does photo editing, so you might try that as well. There is a program called Canvas, which kind of combines together tools for doing vector and raster-based editing of images. So that's also a useful option. And that doesn't cost too much. I think it's $100 for Canvas. Now, a caution. Do not use clip art in your poster. As a general rule, avoid using images that you find on the internet. Unless you have no other option and you need a particular image that someone else has produced to maybe tell the introduction of your story. If you do use an image that you have gotten from somewhere else, make sure that you cite it. And also before you use it, make sure that you check the license. So if you look at an image, say from Wikipedia, they usually have a license that is associated with it. Make sure you take a look at the license, and if you are going to use it, make sure that you're allowed to. And if you are allowed to, usually you're required to include a citation. So make sure that you cite the image that you use. But as a general rule, as much as possible, it's a better idea to make your own pictures. You can take a picture from a paper, say if you looked at a review paper and there's this great image that they use in the introduction that really would help out your introduction, adapt it. You can use one of the vector-based graphics programs and make your own version of their image, and then just cite it and say adapted from this source at the associated with that image. So make sure you cite it, but at the same time, it is a good idea for you getting experience. Plus, when someone comes up to your poster, they don't want to see images that they might have seen elsewhere. They want to see stuff that you've created, and that'll be a lot more impressive as well. When you're making images, you want to pay attention to the image resolution and the image size. Generally, you want the resolution of images as they're going to be on the poster to be somewhere around 200 to 300 dots per inch. You want to be careful when you're making graphics that if you have to shrink the image, make sure that it's still going to be the same size or the same resolution. And another point, when you're changing sizes of images, be very careful about squeezing images or stretching images. If you grab, usually most, at least in PowerPoint, if you grab the corner of the image and you hold down the shift key, you can resize the image without changing the proportions of the image. If you squeeze an image, it looks really bad on a poster, so try not to do that. The other thing you need to worry about resolution is the file size. If you have a picture that's really high resolution, maybe 600 dots per inch, you don't need that level of resolution to make a good picture. But the drawback is that it's going to take up a lot of space. And so if you include a lot of pictures on your poster, you need to be careful about the resolution of each of the posters, because you don't want the poster to be 500 megabytes in size, which gets a little bit cumbersome to work with and to transfer over for printing. So you need to pay attention to those. Okay, so that brings us up to printing and transporting and setting up a poster. Before you print, check again to make sure you've got the right page size. So check the instructions that are provided by the organizers to make sure you've got the right page size. You also want to check with the printing facility that you're going to use, if it is a school print office, or if you're going to go to an outside place to pay for a poster. Make sure that they have the right page size that you've designed your poster for. And check the file size. Again, large files slow things down when you're actually working with them and editing a poster. So take a look at the figures. You can compress images down. In PowerPoint, it's easy to compress images down to 220 dots per inch, which is a good resolution for printing. And if they're too large, then it gets difficult to print because maybe you can't email the file, or you'll have to put it on a flash drive and carry it over to the print office. Now, along the same lines, before you go to print the poster, check the resolution of the figures and make sure they're not pixelated. So if you have images that are, say, 100 dots per inch, and you zoom in and look at them at 200% magnification, you're going to see this pixelation. Everything's going to seem kind of blurry and blocky, and it's going to look like you created the figure using Minecraft or something like that. So you want to avoid that for posters. It's a good idea to print a color proof if you can. If you've got a color printer at home, and print a proof that's on 8.5 by 11 paper, and that gives you kind of an overview to look at the poster and see that everything looks okay. Usually when you print a poster, you want to save it as a PDF file, portable document format file, and that makes it easy to share with a printer. And check the file size after you do that. So as a general rule, if you've got a file size that's above 20 megabytes, it might be difficult to get it printed. If you're sending to a professional printer, you want to check and see, can you email the file? Again, if you're over 10 megabytes, you might have trouble emailing it. You might have to put it on a flash drive and carry it over to the print office. When you pick paper, in addition to the size, the other thing you want to be concerned about is the gloss on the paper. If you have very high gloss paper, if you're in a room with lights, you're going to pick up a lot of glare from the lights, and that makes it difficult to read. So it's a good idea to use semi-gloss paper. It'll still look good, and it'll be easier to read. After printing, if you are sitting there waiting for the poster to come off the printer, make sure you allow time for it to dry, because the ink will smear when it's not dry. So usually the big large-scale printers will actually have a timer on them that they won't actually release the printer until about 3 to 5 minutes after they finish printing. So make sure you let the ink dry. Once it's dry, you can usually roll the poster up, roll it up so that the text and graphics are on the inside so they don't get damaged, and then you can secure it with a rubber band. If you're going to be traveling, it's a good idea to invest in a cardboard poster tube or a plastic poster tube, which is even better. That way you can, if you're taking an airplane or a train, or even just, driving across state in the back of a minivan, you can throw the poster and not worry about it getting crumpled and messed up during the travel. When you get to the meeting site and you go to mount your poster, before you get there, it's a good idea to check and see what, if they can provide it, what information they have about how you're going to be able to put your poster up. A lot of places will use poster boards. Some places will have you mount the poster on a wall. So it's a good idea to find out ahead of time, because It's also a good idea to bring things to attach your poster to whatever they're going to be hanging on. So if they have poster boards, you can use poster pins. In some cases, the poster boards will allow you to use binder clamps, so you can clamp the top of the posters. The other thing that you can use is poster tape. That's actually preferred. So if you can use poster tape, you won't mess up your poster, you won't put holes in it, and you can reuse your poster. So that's probably more recommended. And kind of along the same lines, take care of your poster. A lot of times you'll go to multiple meetings. And if you have a poster, you always have something to present. So if you take care of your poster, you can use the same poster at a couple meetings during the same year. And you don't have to reprint your poster, which costs money. And also, you know, if you're working at a research laboratory, they might ask you to put your poster up on the wall outside the lab. So people can see what research you've done and what research takes place in that laboratory. So posters are useful, so take care of them. Oops. Okay, so presenting your poster. Kind of gone through some of this already, so I'll go through this quickly since we're running a little late on time. Again, this is an informal talk, but when you prepare to give a poster, you want to focus on some of the key points that you want to make sure you get over to your audience. So what I recommend doing, especially the first time you've presented a poster, is make an outline, you know, write up an outline based on your poster layout. So once you've got your poster done, take a look at your poster, put together an outline. The 3 key points in that outline are the introduction, the results, and the conclusion. And within each of those points, you know, expand out the outline to look at what are the key points that you want to focus on for each of those. So in the introduction, what are the key background findings that lead to the hypothesis? So you might have 2 or 3 points within the introduction that you want to make sure that you focus on. With the results, you want to have 1 point for each of the results that you're presenting. And then the conclusion would be, you know, maybe 1, 2, or 3 points that are focused on how your results address the hypothesis that you were testing. Once you've got an outline, what I'd recommend doing is write a presentation. You know, include descriptions of each of the figures, write it down on paper, because that'll help you get an idea as to what you want to present. And then go ahead and display your poster on a wall if you've got a projector, or on a big screen, or even just on your computer screen. And then practice giving your presentation. When you do presentation, do not read a script. Even though I recommend you write down kind of what are the descriptions that you want to present. When you actually do the presentation, it should be much more natural and kind of conversational. So don't try to memorize a script. You want to write it down so that you know what are the key points that you're trying to present, but then allow yourself to think about each of those points and you know, come up with the words as you're thinking about it in your presentation. It'll come across much more naturally as a conversation. But keep your focus on those key points. Your presentation, if you go through and do a practice presentation for a whole poster without having anybody there asking questions, it should take about 5 to 10 minutes. So kind of practice for that time scale. And then hopefully you can find somebody that will ask you questions. Do 1 or 2 practices with them, allowing them to ask you questions and interrupt you. And that'll get you more comfortable with what you're going to be doing with the actual presentation. So when you're doing the presentation, be prepared for questions. Be prepared to be interrupted. Be prepared that maybe you're not going to get through the whole presentation. Don't be discouraged by that. someone might have stopped by and read through your poster and understood most of what you were doing and had a couple questions about a key experiment that you did. And they'll come by and ask you about that. And they don't need to hear the entire presentation. So don't be discouraged by that. A lot of times though, what people will do is they'll walk up to you and say, they'll introduce themselves and then say, could you take me through your poster? And then you can go through and give your presentation, but just be prepared to be interrupted and for people to ask questions. Let's see, what else? Go ahead and ask questions yourself. So, when you get to the end of your presentation, ask them, what kind of research do they do? They're obviously interested in your research, so you might be interested in theirs. So it's a good idea. This is a good opportunity to network with people. Decorum, similar to doing a job interview, you want to dress professionally, generally business casual for doing a poster presentation as appropriate, and be polite to everybody. A lot of the people that you interact with, you might see again one day, either working in a laboratory side by side with them, or they might be someone that you end up getting a job with. It might be someone that might hire you. So be polite and take advantage of the opportunity to network as much as you can. Okay, so this kind of leads directly into giving a scientific talk. A poster presentation is really a practice for giving a scientific talk. And generally, the scientific talk that you want to be prepared to give is a 15-minute research talk. And 15-minute research talk sounds like a lot of time, but it's really not much time. If you're doing a poster presentation, you're preparing for about a 10-minute talk, maybe 15 minutes with questions. So a scientific talk that takes 15 minutes is about the same as doing a poster presentation. And it is, though, essentially the same format that you would use for a longer talk, say an hour-long research seminar. So some of the key points that I just want to highlight quickly. You start off with a title slide. Your title slide includes the title, of course, your name, your affiliation. Include the meeting name. If you're giving a presentation at a meeting, include the meeting name in your title and the date that you're giving the presentation. Next, you want to go into the introduction. You can optionally include an outline of your talk as one of the introduction slides. This is useful if you're giving talks on multiple topics. For a 15-minute talk, you're usually just doing one topic, so this is not required. But then the introduction slide should include going into the background and significance. What's interesting about this area of research, and use figures to support your talk. It's a good idea to use figures as much as possible. So if you had a summary figures for your introduction, include that. For your poster, include that in your research talk. On slides, avoid using complete sentences and drawing, doing whole paragraphs on slides for presentations. You don't want your audience reading the slide. You want your audience to be looking at figures and maybe looking at a few bullet points and then listening to what you're saying. So the slide should really highlight the presentation that you're trying to give. Include citations. If there are references and citations, include those at the bottom of the slide. If you're collaborating with someone, you could include the name of your collaborator at the bottom of the slide if they helped out with one particular experiment or something like that. We'll get into that next when we get to results. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. And then the last part of the introduction should be, what's the research question that you're trying to answer? So you can break this up into objectives and specific aims, but you want to highlight why is it important and what's your overall goal in doing the research. Then you go into really what's the main body of your presentation, which is the results. For a 15-minute talk, you're probably not going to have more than 5 slides that you're going to present. Each slide is going to take you 2 or 3 minutes to present. So, at 5 slides, 2 or 3 minutes, that's 10 to 15 minutes. You've already used up all the time for your talk. So you want to, in doing a 15-minute research talk, you really need to focus on key results that you want to present. You might not present all of the experiments that you've done in the laboratory, but focus on key experiments that are going to allow you to tell a story. And keep in mind, for a 15-minute talk, you're trying to tell a story. You want, to get your audience engaged in the story, and it should flow as if you're telling a story. And then you come to the conclusion, and it's kind of the climax of the story. You get to the point where, everything starts to fit together. Results, similar to doing a poster presentation, should be mostly, if not all, graphics and data. Avoid using a lot of text in the results. And sorry. Okay. And go ahead and use labels for all the, if you're doing graphs, make sure you label the axes. If you're doing gel figures, for example, use labels to highlight features within the data that you want the audience to pay attention to. You should describe the purpose of the experiment that you're doing. What question are you trying to answer with that experiment? And then describe how the experiment was done. You want people to understand what the experiment is and how you actually accomplished it. And then describe the result and discuss what the meaning of the result is. So this is kind of a combination of results and discussion. And then in the conclusion, you want to summarize your results, show how everything fit together, and focus on the research question. Do the results that you have answer the question you were trying to answer? If not, what do you want to do next? What can you do next to try to answer the original question that you were trying to address? And then at the end, you want to include an acknowledgement slide. So this should include the names of everybody that contributed to the research, other members of the laboratory that you're working in, include affiliations. Sometimes you'll work with collaborators in different laboratories, maybe at a different campus. Make sure you include their affiliations. You also want to include any collaborators that contributed to your research in any way. Maybe you walked down the hall and borrowed media from another laboratory, so give them an acknowledgement. It doesn't hurt to acknowledge everybody that helped you out. If you had to use equipment that was in another lab, include an acknowledgement for that. If you talked to another professor and he gave you some ideas that were helpful in accomplishing your research, include that in the acknowledgements. Then you also want to include facilities and any services that you use for research. For instance, if you did DNA sequencing as part of your research, include what facilities you use for DNA sequencing. And then also you need to include sources of funding. Who actually paid for the research? If you're paid a stipend, who paid you to do the research? So make sure you include that as in that last slide. Now, last thing we want to talk about is a flash talk. So if, in some cases, if you're going to a meeting and doing poster presentation, the organizers might, take a look at your abstract and say, hey, that's interesting. Maybe you want to advertise that, and they'll give you the opportunity to give a 3-minute flash talk. Now, a flash talk is basically the abstract for your poster. So you want to kind of follow the format for an abstract. You want to include a very brief introduction. You want to be able to cover the hypothesis, the key result that helps you answer the question, and a very quick conclusion. In flash talks, you may or may not be allowed to show a slide. So in some cases, you just have to get up and do basically what is an elevator pitch for your poster. In cases where you can include a slide, you want to do just one slide. You only have 3 minutes, so you're not going to be able to switch slides. So you do put together one slide that includes the title of your project, your name, affiliation, the meeting, and the date. And then you might include a background bullet, just a very brief statement that if it's not obvious from the title as to what the general area of research is. And you might include the research question that you're trying to answer. And then pick one key result from your poster and put that on the slide so that it highlights a key result that helps to answer the question. And that's all you're going to really be able to cover in 3 minutes. So do not try to present your entire poster. Do not try to give an entire 15-minute presentation in 3 minutes. It is exhausting to watch someone try to do that. You want to introduce yourself, describe what is the research question, maybe a little bit of background, but that should take about 1 minute. Then you've got 1 minute to describe your experimental approach and what is the key result. And then 1 minute to describe, how does that key result answer the research question that you were trying to answer. So it's kind of really a summary of what you include in your abstract for your poster. Okay, so some resources that I wanted to show you real quick. Let me see if I can switch this over. Okay, I think you guys should be able to see these online and without having to sign in to these websites. So ASBMB is the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, and they just had a meeting this spring, which the in-face meeting got canceled, so they posted everything virtually. And so you can actually go to their meeting site. Up at the top here, this is the 2002 annual meeting, and they posted a lot of virtual content here. So that includes seminars, research seminars that were given. So you can actually, if you're interested in any of these topics, you can go through and see what people presented as research seminars. And since we're talking about posters, they have virtual poster presentations. So you can, some people submitted videos of their poster presentations since they couldn't actually go to the meeting and do a presentation. They also have a Twitter poster session, which is going on tomorrow. So at 1 o'clock tomorrow in chemical biology, 2 o'clock in lipids and membranes, and 3 o'clock with signal transduction. So if you're interested in any of those, you can, and you have a Twitter account, you can join them and see what a virtual poster presentation is. So that might be fun to participate in. It's tomorrow, so if you're not doing anything. Another resource I wanted to point out here, also on ASBMB site, is they have a video kind of webinar for doing science in a flash, how to give a flash talk, how to give a very brief and focused talk. And they've got 3 invited speakers to do this. I'm not going to show you this because I think it's about 50 minutes long, but I think that's a good resource to take a look at. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight here is an example of a full research seminar. This one I think is particularly interesting. This is Jennifer Doudna, who gave the annual lecture, or the lecture at the 2018 Biophysical Society. She gave the annual lecture. I think it's 56 minutes long. It is a very good research seminar. It's very clearly presented. It's very results and figure driven. And she does an exceptional job of explaining each of the research results that make it very easy to understand. It's also, she's talking about the CRISPR-Cas9 system, which you have probably heard of. CRISPR is kind of has been a hot topic for at least 10 years as a way to do gene editing. So I'd recommend taking a look at that if you're interested. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here, and I'll stop recording, and then I can entertain any questions that you might have.